Do you know how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a congresswoman? A very famous and influential congresswoman. Well, she had no political experience and no political interest, quite frankly. None throughout her life. Growing up in well-to-do circumstances in New York, in Westchester County, never had a political thought in her empty little head. But then, in what was it? Something like 2014, 2015 or something like that? She answered an ad. It was a casting ad placed by some political operatives in New York, progressive political operatives, who had figured out that they wanted to primary the sitting congressman at the time and replace him with somebody more progressive, more in line with what these political operatives thought and wanted to achieve in Congress. And so they figured out, they market tested, in fact, the perfect candidate. And that's how they came across AOC, and that's how she became Congresswoman AOC. And this isn't that unusual, actually, because the current president of Ukraine, where I am right now, I'm in Kharkov during the bombing, the siege of Kharkov. It's quite the experience, and I'll tell it to you in some other opportunity. But for now, the president here, Volodymyr Zelensky, he was an actor, a very successful actor, as a matter of fact. He was into romantic comedies, that kind of thing, you know. And he was doing very well for himself. And in 2014, 2015, he was cast in the lead role in a TV show called Servant of the People, where he played the president of Ukraine. And this show was financed by a oligarch called Ihor Kolomoisky, And Ihor Kolomoisky set up Zelensky as the president. Just puppeteered him into the presidency. You know, astroturfed his support and all the rest of it, bought out some people, of course. And now he's president of Ukraine, playing the role of a lifetime, if you think about it. Yeah, he is the president of a nation under siege. Yeah, that's the role he's playing. Although it's not turning out the way Zelensky wants it to turn out. No, see, the word around the campfire is that Kolomoisky, who fled to Switzerland long ago, he's not in Ukraine at all. Well, Kolomoisky is gone, and so the people who are now puppeteering Zelensky are actually these far-right neo-Nazis. And the word is that they keep him deliberately coked up to the gills, so he's easier to manage. Coked up all day long. I mean, sort of like Tony Montana at the end of Scarface, like that. And these far-right extremists, that's how they manipulate and use him to do what they want. And what these far-right extremists want is to hold on to power and hopefully drag in the West into this war, because they don't want to fall into the hands of the Russians, because the Russians hate them. And the Russians have said outright, openly, that the second they get these thieves and thugs and criminals, because that's what they are, the second they get hold of them, they're going to try them as criminals and hang them high. Oh yeah, that's what the Russians are saying. And so that's why the people who are now puppeteering Zelensky are terrified, and they don't want to give up power. And you can tell that Zelensky is coked up. You know, like one of the advantages I have of not speaking Russian or Ukraine is that when I see Zelensky talk on TV, I don't understand what he's saying. And so I look at how he says it, his body language. And if you've been around the club scene at any stretch of, for any stretch of time in your lifetime, you can tell right away when somebody's coked up. And this guy's coked up. That's how they're manipulating him. That's how they're puppeteering him. And he's not the only leader who's a puppet rather, who's being puppeteered by other forces. You got Joe Biden. Joe Biden, you know, sniffing Joe, you know, he is out to lunch. He is clearly senile. And I know of at least 4 different groups that are puppeteering him. And they're fighting among each other, by the way. That's the great problem. When you have a leader who's a puppet, there are lots of people who are trying to pull the strings, and so the puppet jitters and jaggers in different directions. Yeah, because it's not one hand controlling him. No, it's several. And they fight behind the scenes. That's what's happening with Zelensky. That's what's happening with Joe Biden. The 4 factions that kind of like vie with one another to control Joe Biden are the Biden family, who wants to just continue the grift and not get indicted. That's their objective. The Obama people, because old Barack Obama himself wants to be the guy directing the Biden administration, you know. Then there's Hillary Clinton neocons and the people in Foggy Bottom, you know, that whole warmongering crowd at the State Department. And the fourth group are the progressives, who want all kinds of spending and green energy and all this nonsense. And they're fighting among one another to control this puppet known as Joe Biden. Ding, ding. And you have the same thing going on, like, for instance, in Germany with Olaf Scholz. He's a puppet of powers in Germany that are too complicated to explain in this video, and it doesn't really matter because you get the picture. In Germany, Emmanuel Macron in France, he's a puppet. Boris Johnson, who's hanging on for political life, and the only reason he's still around as prime minister is because he's being puppeteered by forces within the Conservative Party and some moneyed interests outside of it. Yeah. All the leaders in the West are puppets. We don't have any strong leader at this time. Not one. Not one who's actually in charge. I mean, you can say whatever you want about, say, Bill Clinton or George Herbert Walker Bush or even Ronald Reagan, but they were running things. I mean, Reagan, he didn't micromanage, right? But he had a line. And that line, well, everybody towed it. And anybody who didn't tow it, they were gone soon enough, see? But with puppets, they have no line because they don't have any agency. And that's the problem we have in the West. None of our leaders have any kind of agency. They are not in control. And that's why when we look at Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia, we're so impressed. Because despite the fact that they are dictators, despite the fact that they are ruthless individuals, we respect the fact that they are actually running things. They are the guys in charge. What they say goes. And of course, like any politician, he has to take a little bit of suggestions, a little bit of give and take in order to maintain his position. But he's basically the guy in charge. Whereas in the West, we don't have anybody in charge. And if only we had some Illuminati or some Klaus Schwab or some figure at the top who was the ultimate hand, puppeteering us all with his monster hand, controlling us, and we're just dancing around for him, right? It would be great if that were the case, but the problem is that that's not the case, man. It's not. The Joe Biden administration is proof positive of this. You have a bunch of different factions, all of them fighting one another, none of them getting anything done. Often they're fighting one another, and the different policies that they implement contradict one another, hurting the United States, hurting the West. That's why the West is going down the tubes. It's because there's nobody at the wheel. And a lot of us, foolishly, in my opinion, believe that there's some ultimate cabal above it all. There's none. There's none. There's just incompetence. What's that saying? That the earth is held up by a turtle, and holding up the turtle is another turtle, and you look over and it's turtles all the way down. Well, see, when you look up in our society, in our leadership classes, you look up and you see the next guy and he's an incompetent. And you look up above him and there's another incompetent. And you look all the way up. Incompetence all the way to the top. Incompetents who are constantly fighting one another. Incompetents who are destroying a peace and security and prosperity that took decades to build. And countless millions of lives lost. The human suffering that was necessary to create the wonderful world that we were living in. Think of 2019. For all the problems that we had in 2019, wouldn't you give your left arm to be back there in those good old days? Yeah, I know I would. It was so easy. Everything worked. Everything was just peachy. It took so long to build that world. And the leaders we have today, these puppets, they're throwing it all away. And it's not even their fault because they don't have agency. They're not in control of anything, I mean, Joe Biden isn't even in control of his shits. You know what I'm saying? No, it's the people pulling the strings, but they're people pulling them in different directions. There's no one line. And because there isn't a single line, we're going to wind up in chaos. We are already winding up in chaos. And soon enough, it seems increasingly clear to me that this war in Ukraine is going to widen. It's going to widen because the West, because it has no leadership, and because these different factions want to improve their situation economically, politically, socially, They're pushing for a war that cannot be won. A war that will be destructive and put the nail in the coffin of our entire civilization. Understand what's going on. Understand that the people leading you are not leading you. Understand that even the people pulling those strings, they don't know what they're doing. They're incompetence all the way to the top. Understand that. And that's why we're heading into a brick wall. That's why this is all going to go tits up in a really ugly way, because nobody is at the wheel. We are drifting towards our destruction. And we are being led by puppets, by clowns.